At our divorce, my husband showed up with his new girlfriend, grinning like he'd won. The judge turned to me and said, "Ma'am, as owner of this courthouse, how would you like to proceed?" His smile dropped. I handed him a broom. "Your new job starts today. Sweep the floors you walked out on." The judge's gavel slammed down like a thunderclap, jolting me back to reality. My fingers clutched the manila envelope containing divorce papers, knuckles white against the pale yellow. Across the polished oak table sat Daniel, his arm draped possessively around Stephanie's shoulders, both wearing matching smirks that said they'd already won. "Mrs. Rachel Wilson, is there anything you'd like to add before we proceed?" Judge Franklin's voice cut through the tension. I opened my mouth to respond when his clerk rushed in, whispered something in his ear. The judge's eyebrows shot up and he cleared his throat. "I've just been informed of an unusual situation." He shuffled through some papers handed to him. "It appears Mrs. Wilson is now the legal owner of this courthouse, following the passing of her grandmother, Judge Catherine Mason." Daniel's smug smile faltered for the first time. "As owner of this property," Judge Franklin continued, sounding as surprised as everyone looked, "you have certain privileges according to the deed. How would you like to proceed?" A week earlier I wouldn't have known how to answer. But that was before everything changed. The lawyer's office had been stuffy that Monday morning. "Your grandmother was quite specific," Brian explained, sliding the will across his desk. "The courthouse was privatized 2 years ago as part of the county's cost-cutting measures. Catherine purchased it anonymously through a holding company." I stared at the paperwork in disbelief. "She bought the courthouse? Why?" "Catherine always said justice needed a home," Brian smiled sadly. "She didn't trust the county commissioners to maintain it properly." He tapped on another paragraph. "And now it's yours." The inheritance news should have been the most shocking part of my week. It wasn't. That same evening I was searching for my phone charger in Daniel's nightstand when I found them. Dozens of text messages between him and Stephanie. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through their exchanges, each message more intimate than the last. The most recent, "Can't wait until she's out of the picture. 2 more weeks, baby." I sat on our bed, the bed we'd shared for 7 years, holding his phone as my world collapsed. Photos. Plans for their future. Complaints about me. The timestamps revealed their affair had started while I was spending nights at the hospital with Catherine during her final months. When Daniel came home I was waiting, his unlocked phone on the coffee table between us. "How long?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. He didn't even try to deny it. "Rachel, you have to understand." "How long?" His shoulders sagged, not in shame but relief. 14 months. It just happened. With my best friend. The one who was my maid of honor. You were always at the hospital with Catherine. Stephanie was there for me." I laughed, a hollow sound I didn't recognize. "While I was caring for my dying grandmother, you decided the appropriate response was to sleep with my best friend?" "I wasn't happy," he said, as if that explained everything. "We haven't been happy for a long time." By morning he was gone along with his essential belongings. No real goodbye, just a text, "Staying at Stephanie's. My lawyer will be in touch." 3 days later I stood in Catherine's study, sorting through decades of her life. The house still smelled like her leather-bound law books and the faint trace of lavender perfume. I ran my fingers along her desk, remembering how she'd sit there in the evenings, glasses perched on her nose, reviewing cases long after retirement. That's when I found it, wedged between 2 legal volumes on property law. A yellow document dated 1923, signed by my great-grandfather, Judge William Mason. The Mason Clause, as it was labeled, detailed specific conditions of the courthouse donation to the county, including an unusual provision that the owner could assign remedial community service to any individual who brought disgrace upon the court or its proceedings. I almost missed its significance until a note in Catherine's handwriting caught my eye. "Still legally binding, confirmed 2022 during privatization." My grandmother had known exactly what she was doing. The funeral was held that Friday. Catherine would have approved of the simplicity. No overwrought eulogies, just sincere words from those who respected her. I stood receiving condolences, my black dress hanging loosely on my frame after a week of barely eating. "She was a remarkable woman," Judge Franklin said, clasping my hand. "Our county's first female judge. We'll never see her like again. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat, when a familiar laugh cut through the solemn atmosphere. Turning toward the sound, I spotted them near the entrance. Daniel in a charcoal suit I'd bought him last Christmas. Stephanie beside him in a dress that was definitely not appropriate for a funeral. They weren't even pretending to mourn, caught up in their own private joke. They hadn't seen me yet. I watched as Stephanie adjusted Daniel's tie, her fingers lingering on his chest. He beamed at her with an affection he hadn't shown me in years. The sight should have crushed me, but instead something hardened inside. It wasn't just anger. It was resolve. Catherine had taught me that justice wasn't about punishment. It was about restoration and consequences that fit the offense. As I looked at them, then down at my grandmother's rings on my finger, a plan began forming. In that moment, standing among mourners while my husband flirted with my former best friend at my grandmother's funeral, I understood why Catherine had purchased the courthouse. She created a safety net I never knew I would need. The last gift from a woman who had always been 3 steps ahead of everyone else. I turned to Brian, who'd been watching the same scene with thinly veiled disgust. "I need you to keep the courthouse ownership quiet until the divorce hearing," I said. "And I need to understand exactly how that community service clause works." He nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. Catherine would be proud. As Daniel finally noticed me watching and had the decency to look uncomfortable, I fingered the old document in my purse. My grandmother had given me more than a building. She'd given me the perfect opportunity for justice. And in 2 weeks, when Daniel walked into court expecting to take half of everything I had left, he would discover just how much Catherine had taught her granddaughter about the scales of justice. 2 days after Catherine's funeral, I sat cross-legged on my living room floor surrounded by a fortress of cardboard boxes. Daniel had texted that he needed more of his things. Rather than let him waltz in whenever he pleased, I decided to pack everything myself. His phone had been the first piece of evidence, but as I sorted through his belongings, I found more breadcrumbs of betrayal. A receipt for a weekend getaway at a lakeside cabin dated last December, while I was spending Christmas Eve at Catherine's hospital bedside. A silver bracelet with Stephanie's initials engraved inside, too expensive for a casual gift between friends. Hotel keycards tucked into winter coat pockets. My hands trembled as I unearthed a hidden folder in his desk drawer. Inside were printouts of real estate listings in Colorado. Estates Stephanie had always talked about moving to. Properties Daniel and I had never discussed. Houses meant for their future, not ours. I reached for my phone and scrolled back through Daniel's messages I'd photographed before he took his phone back. The earliest exchanges with Stephanie started 14 months ago, when Catherine had her first stroke. "Rachel's at the hospital again," he'd written. "Come over." The reply came quickly. "On my way." She'll never know. But it wasn't just the messages that haunted me. It was the memories now cast in a different light. The warning signs I'd missed while juggling hospital visits and my own career. Last Thanksgiving, Stephanie had arrived at our dinner party wearing a perfume I'd never smelled before. That evening, Daniel disappeared for 20 minutes to take a work call. When he returned, that same scent clung faintly to his collar. During Catherine's second hospitalization, I'd called home past midnight to tell Daniel I was staying overnight. In the background, I heard a cabinet close, the clink of glasses. When questioned, he claimed he was just getting water. The next day, one of my wine glasses was in the dishwasher, lipstick on the rim that wasn't my shade. There were dozens of such moments. Daniel working late, weekend errands taking hours longer than they should, Stephanie canceling our lunch plans with last-minute excuses. 4 months, they'd been laughing behind my back while I sat at my grandmother's bedside, holding her hand as she slipped away. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. Brian stood on my porch, his familiar face a welcome relief. "Brought reinforcements," he said, holding up a bottle of wine and takeout bags from our favorite diner. "Figured you weren't eating properly." Brian and I had known each other since 3rd grade when he defended me against playground bullies. Now he defended people in courtrooms, continuing a Mason family tradition despite not sharing our blood. "You're a lifesaver," I said, clearing space at the kitchen table. As we ate, I showed him what I'd found. Brian listened, his expression darkening with each new detail. "The worst part is how calculated it was," I said, pushing food around my plate. "They were waiting for Catherine to die. Planning their escape while I was planning funeral arrangements." Brian reached across the table, his hand covering mine. Rachel, this changes things legally. Infidelity with documented evidence, especially this extensive, impacts divorce settlements in our state. Does it matter? Daniel's lawyer will still try to take half of everything. I looked around at the house we'd bought together 4 years ago. I might lose this place. Actually, Brian said, pulling papers from his briefcase, that's what I came to discuss. I've been reviewing Catherine's will and the courthouse documentation. It's remarkable. For the next hour he explained the complexities of my inheritance. The courthouse had been built on land donated by my great-grandfather William Mason in 1923, with specific conditions attached to the gift. When the county privatized the building 2 years ago, Catherine had purchased it through a shell corporation, ensuring the original deed restrictions remained intact. The Mason Clause is legally fascinating, Brian said, pointing to highlighted sections. It was written to ensure the courthouse would always serve justice, not just technically but morally. Anyone who brings disgrace upon the court can be assigned community service by the property owner. Is that even enforceable today? Brian nodded. Catherine had it verified by the state Supreme Court during the privatization. She updated the language but kept the spirit intact. It's binding. So I could assign community service to Daniel? Yes, if the presiding judge acknowledges the clause. A plan began forming in my mind, but before I could respond my phone buzzed. An email from an unfamiliar law firm. I opened it to find divorce papers, along with a letter outlining Daniel's demands. Half of our savings, half the equity in our house, half of my retirement accounts. Even half of a small inheritance Catherine had left me years ago. He wants everything, I said, passing my phone to Brian. Even though he's the one who... Standard aggressive opening position, Brian said, scanning the document. They don't know about the courthouse yet. That's our advantage. The doorbell rang. Daniel stood on the porch, Stephanie waiting in his car at the curb. I'm here for my boxes, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. They're in the garage. I crossed my arms. I received your lawyer's email. Rachel, be reasonable. I just want what's fair. Fair. The word tasted bitter. Was it fair when you were sleeping with my best friend while I was caring for my dying grandmother? Daniel's face hardened. Catherine was all you cared about for the past year. I needed someone who put me first. And you think that entitles you to half of everything I have left? He shrugged. That's how divorce works. You'll get over it eventually. As he turned to leave, I called after him. Daniel, one more thing. The funeral suit you wore yesterday? The one I bought you? I donated it this morning. It was petty, but the flash of annoyance on his face felt like the first victory in a war I hadn't asked for but was determined to win. After he drove away, Brian stood beside me on the porch. You know he has no idea what's coming, right? I watched the taillights of Daniel's car disappear around the corner, Stephanie's blonde head visible in the passenger seat. Catherine always said justice works best when it's unexpected. I turned to Brian. Let's make sure our first court date is in courtroom 3. Her old courtroom? Why? Because that's where the Mason family portrait hangs, I said. I want to see Daniel's face when he realizes exactly whose legacy he's up against. 2 weeks passed in a blur of legal preparations. Brian arranged for our divorce hearing to be scheduled in courtroom 3 as I'd requested. We met almost daily, crafting our strategy with the meticulous care of master chess players. Everything has to appear normal until the right moment, Brian explained as we sat in his office, surrounded by case files and takeout containers. Daniel's lawyer has already filed motions to expedite property division. He's in a hurry to start his new life, I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Which works in our favor. We'll let him think he's winning until we reveal our hand. We decided I would visit the courthouse the following day, officially to familiarize myself with the proceedings, but really to begin understanding my inheritance more intimately. The Jefferson County Courthouse stood like a limestone sentinel in the town square, its classical columns and broad steps projecting authority and permanence. Catherine had often told me how she'd walk up those steps each morning, feeling the weight of responsibility with every stride. Now, as I climbed them myself, I felt strangely like I was walking in her footsteps. Inside, the high ceilings and polished marble floors echoed with whispered conversations and the click of heels. I found my way to the maintenance office, where Brian had arranged for me to meet Walter Jenkins, the building supervisor who'd worked there for over 30 years. "Miss Rachel," Walter greeted me, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile. "Judge Mason's granddaughter. Been expecting you." Walter gave me a behind-the-scenes tour, showing me everything from the ancient boiler room to the judge's private chambers. As we walked, he shared stories about Catherine. "Your grandmother, she knew every person who worked here by name," Walter said as we passed a young janitor mopping the corridor. "Maria, how's your son doing at college?" he called out. The woman looked up, surprised. "He's doing great, Mr. Jenkins. First in his engineering class." Walter turned back to me. "Judge Mason set up a scholarship fund for Maria's boy. Did it quietly, didn't want recognition. That's the kind of person she was." Throughout the day, I met court clerks, bailiffs, and administrative staff who had similar stories. Catherine had remembered birthdays, attended funerals, celebrated marriages. She'd been strict on the bench but compassionate beyond it. When my wife got sick, one elderly security guard told me, "Judge Mason adjusted my schedule so I could take her to treatments. Never docked my pay. Said family comes first." By afternoon, I felt both humbled and strengthened. These people had respected my grandmother not just for her legal mind but for her humanity. I wasn't just inheriting a building. I was inheriting a legacy of fairness and integrity. I was heading toward the exit when my phone rang. Daniel's lawyer. "Mrs. Wilson," the voice on the other end oozed false courtesy, "I'm calling with a final settlement offer before we proceed to court. My client is being extremely generous." The generous offer would leave me with 30% of our assets and saddled with most of our debt. I muted the phone and took a deep breath, remembering Brian's coaching. "I'll review it with my attorney," I said evenly. "Thank you for the call." That evening, Brian brought additional documents he'd subpoenaed from Daniel's bank. What we discovered left me gasping. "He opened a separate account last year," Brian said, spreading statements across my dining table. "He's been diverting money from your joint accounts for months." The statements revealed withdrawals timed perfectly with Catherine's health declines, as if each hospital admission was an opportunity for Daniel to siphon more funds. "There's more," Brian said grimly, pulling out real estate documents. "He put a deposit on a house in Colorado 3 months ago. Used your joint savings, but only his name is on the paperwork." I stared at the property listing. A mountain home with views of the Rockies. Daniel had always dismissed my dreams of traveling as impractical, yet he'd been planning his escape to a luxury retreat. Can he do that? Not legally. It's financial infidelity on top of actual infidelity. Brian sorted the papers into neat piles. "The judge will take a very dim view of this." As the hearing date approached, I felt increasingly nervous. What if our plan didn't work? What if Daniel's expensive lawyer outmaneuvered us? The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. At 2 a.m., I decided to go to Catherine's house one last time. The old Victorian had been in our family for generations. I'd already decided to move in after the divorce. A fresh start in a place filled with better memories than the house Daniel and I had shared. I wandered through the dark halls until I reached Catherine's bedroom. Her closet still held her clothes, the faint scent of lavender lingering among the fabric. Behind her winter coats, I spotted a garment bag I hadn't noticed during previous visits. Inside was her judicial robe, the black fabric still crisp despite years of use. Pinned to it was an envelope addressed simply, "To the next generation of justice." With trembling fingers I opened it. "My dearest Rachel, if you're reading this, I've passed on and you've discovered what I've left you. The courthouse isn't just a building. It's the physical embodiment of our family's commitment to justice. William built it, Edward defended it, I presided in it, and now you must preserve it. The Mason Clause exists because my father believed true justice should have teeth. In your hands, this power must be wielded not for vengeance but for balance. Remember, the goal isn't to destroy the wrongdoer but to restore what was broken, even if that means breaking pride to rebuild character. When you stand in that courtroom tomorrow, you'll face someone who wronged you. Choose your response wisely. Justice without mercy is tyranny, but mercy without justice is surrender. I've watched you grow into a woman of strength and compassion. I trust you'll know exactly what to do when the moment comes. With all my love, Catherine." I clutched the letter to my chest, tears streaming down my face. In that moment I felt Catherine's presence so strongly it was as if she stood beside me, her hand on my shoulder. I carefully rehung the robe but took the letter with me. As I drove home in the pre-dawn light, I realized that Catherine hadn't just left me a building, she'd given me back my power. Tomorrow Daniel would discover exactly what that meant. Morning arrived with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. Catherine's letter rested in my blazer pocket, a tangible reminder of her strength. I dressed carefully. A navy suit she had given me for my first job interview, pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother, and a quiet determination that came from somewhere deep inside. "Ready?" Brian asked when he picked me up. I nodded. "Let's finish this." The courthouse steps were already busy with the day's legal proceedings. As we climbed them, I felt eyes on me, nods from staff members I'd met during my visit, a reassuring smile from Walter Jenkins standing near the entrance. "You're not alone here," Brian murmured, noticing the subtle gestures of support. Courtroom 3 was exactly as Catherine had described it in her stories. Imposing oak paneling, the state seal mounted prominently behind the judge's bench, and on the side wall the Mason family portrait. For generations of legal minds stared down at the proceedings, Catherine among them, her eyes seeming to follow me as I took my seat. The doors opened again and my stomach clenched. Daniel walked in, Stephanie trailing behind him like an afterthought. He'd gotten a haircut, bought a new suit. They slid into the seats across the aisle, not even trying to hide their connection. Stephanie placed her hand on his arm possessively, both of them radiating the confidence of people who believed they'd already won. Daniel's attorney, a shark-faced man named Gregory Palmer, strutted in moments later, flanked by two younger associates carrying stacks of binders. The excessive show of legal force was clearly meant to intimidate. "Quite the production," Brian whispered. "3 attorneys for a straightforward divorce?" "He's trying to overwhelm us," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath my calm exterior. The bailiff called the court to order and Judge Franklin entered. He was a contemporary of Catherine's, having served alongside her for many years. His eyes flickered to the family portrait, then to me, and I caught a glimpse of something. Recognition, perhaps, or remembrance. "Divorce proceedings for Wilson versus Wilson," he announced. "Counselors, your appearances, please." Palmer rose first, his voice booming with practiced authority. "Gregory Palmer for the petitioner, Daniel Wilson, Your Honor. We're prepared to move forward expeditiously today." Brian stood next. "Brian Mitchell for the respondent, Rachel Wilson, Your Honor." Judge Franklin nodded. "Mr. Palmer, as petitioner's counsel, you may begin." Palmer launched into his opening, painting Daniel as a hard-working husband who had suffered emotional neglect during my grandmother's illness. The characterization was so far from reality that I had to dig my nails into my palms to keep from objecting. "My client simply wants an equitable division of marital assets," Palmer concluded, "including the family home, retirement accounts, and any inheritance received during the marriage." I glanced at Daniel, who was leaning back in his chair, a satisfied smile playing at his lips. Beside him, Stephanie mirrored his smugness. Judge Franklin turned to Brian. "Counsel for the respondent?" Brian rose slowly. "Your Honor, before addressing property division, there's a unique jurisdictional matter the court should be aware of." He paused. "The respondent, Mrs. Rachel Wilson, is now the legal owner of this courthouse building following the passing of her grandmother, Judge Catherine Mason." The revelation fell like a thunderclap in the silent room. Daniel's head snapped toward me, his smile vanishing. Stephanie's hand froze on his arm. Palmer recovered quickly. "Your Honor, this is clearly a delaying tactic. Even if true, private ownership of a public building has no bearing on divorce proceedings. Actually," Brian continued, producing a document, "I have here the certified deed transfer, along with the original Mason clause dating to 1923 and reaffirmed during the county's privatization process 2 years ago." Judge Franklin accepted the paperwork, studying it with increasing interest. "I remember when the county sold this building," he said, looking up. "Catherine never mentioned she was the buyer." "She preferred discretion, Your Honor," I said, speaking for the first time. Daniel's face had gone from shock to calculating. He leaned toward Palmer, whispering urgently. Palmer nodded and stood again. "Your Honor, regardless of building ownership, we maintain that Mrs. Wilson's inheritance is subject to equitable division as marital property." Judge Franklin peered at Palmer over his reading glasses. Mr. Palmer, are you familiar with the Mason Clause? Palmer hesitated. I can't say that I am, Your Honor. Then allow me to enlighten you. Judge Franklin read aloud. The owner of this property reserves the right to assign remedial community service to any individual who brings disgrace upon the court or its proceedings, as determined by the presiding judge. He looked up. This clause was written by Judge William Mason and has been upheld by our state Supreme Court. Quite remarkable legal craftsmanship, actually. The confidence drained from Daniel's face. He whispered something to Palmer, who shook his head in disbelief. Judge Franklin turned to me. Mrs. Wilson, as the current property owner, do you wish to invoke this clause? The courtroom fell silent. I could feel Catherine's letter against my heart, her words echoing in my mind. Justice without mercy is tyranny, but mercy without justice is surrender. I stood, my voice steadier than I expected. Yes, Your Honor. Daniel Wilson has disgraced this court and my family by demanding half of all assets while concealing financial information and engaging in documented infidelity with my former friend. I pulled out the evidence Brian and I had gathered. These bank statements show he's been hiding money and making property purchases without my knowledge, all while I was caring for my dying grandmother. Judge Franklin reviewed the documents, his expression darkening. Mr. Wilson, these are serious allegations. Daniel stood, his face flushed. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. She's trying to use her grandmother's position to seek justice, I interrupted. I'm not asking for revenge, Your Honor. I'm asking for consequences that fit the offense. And what would you propose? Judge Franklin asked. I reached into my pocket, touching Catherine's letter for courage. I request that Daniel Wilson be assigned janitorial duties at this courthouse for 1 year, working under the supervision of building management. In exchange, I'll drop all claims against him for financial infidelity and hidden assets. Daniel's face contorted in outrage. You can't be serious. I'm an executive. I can't. Mr. Wilson, Judge Franklin cut in sharply, you're not in a position to object. The evidence of your financial deception is substantial. He turned to me. Mrs. Wilson, your proposal is unusual but within your rights under the Mason Clause. I'll take a brief recess to consider it. As Judge Franklin left the bench, Daniel stormed across the aisle toward me, his face twisted with fury. You think this is funny? You think you can humiliate me like this? Brian stepped between us. Back off, Daniel. Now. This isn't over, Daniel hissed at me. I met his gaze steadily. You're right. It's just beginning. Judge Franklin returned to the bench after 20 minutes, his decision written clearly on his face even before he spoke. Having reviewed the evidence and the legal standing of the Mason Clause, I find the respondent's request both reasonable and justified. He looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Wilson, you have demonstrated financial deception and betrayal of trust. Under normal circumstances, this would result in punitive financial judgments. Mrs. Wilson has offered an alternative I find fitting. Daniel's mouth opened in protest, but Palmer placed a restraining hand on his arm. Beginning Monday, you will report to Mr. Walter Jenkins for janitorial duties at this courthouse for a period of 1 year. Standard working hours, minimum wage. In exchange, Mrs. Wilson will waive claims to your hidden assets, and you will surrender any claim to the marital home. The gavel came down with finality. Court adjourned. As people began filing out, Stephanie remained frozen in her seat, her expression cycling between shock and calculation. When Daniel turned to her, she avoided his eyes. We should go, I heard her say, already inching toward the exit. We can fight this. But the look on her face told a different story. She hadn't signed up for a boyfriend with a janitor's salary and a year-long obligation that would keep him tied to this town, and to me. Walter approached as the courtroom emptied. I'll take good care of him, Miss Rachel, he said with a wink. We start at 6 a.m. sharp. On Monday morning I couldn't resist driving past the courthouse. Daniel's luxury sedan was parked in the service lot, looking absurdly out of place. Through the window of the maintenance entrance, I glimpsed him being issued a gray uniform by Walter. The sight should have felt triumphant, but instead I felt something unexpected. A quiet sense of closure. That evening, Brian came over with Chinese food and paperwork for the Catherine Mason Courthouse Preservation Foundation. The judge approved the settlement formally, he said, passing me the documents. Daniel's lawyer tried to appeal but withdrew it this afternoon. Did he say why? Brian grinned. Apparently Stephanie had a change of heart about their relationship. Packed up and left for Colorado without him yesterday. I wasn't surprised. Stephanie had always followed the money from her wealthy college boyfriend to her successful boss to my husband. Daniel, without his executive salary and with courthouse dust on his shoes, held no appeal for her. How do you feel about that? Brian asked carefully. I considered the question. Relieved, actually. Their relationship was built on lies. At least now the truth is out in the open. Over the next few weeks, I divided my time between settling into Catherine's house and setting up the foundation. The courthouse needed repairs Catherine had planned but hadn't completed. The roof leaked in the east wing, the heating system was ancient, and the accessibility ramps needed updating. My background in historical preservation made me uniquely qualified to oversee the renovations. Each morning I'd arrive to find contractors and review plans, occasionally catching glimpses of Daniel mopping floors or emptying trash bins. He'd avert his eyes whenever we passed, his face flushed with humiliation. It took a month before he spoke to me. I was examining water damage in a corridor when he approached with his cleaning cart. Is this what you wanted? He asked bitterly. To watch me scrub toilets every day? I considered his question seriously. No, Daniel. What I wanted was a husband who wouldn't betray me while my grandmother was dying. What I wanted was honesty. I gestured to his uniform. This isn't about humiliation. It's about consequences for choices. His shoulders slumped slightly. Stephanie's gone. Took what was left in our account and moved to Colorado with some guy she met online. I'm sorry, I said and meant it. No matter what he'd done, being used and discarded hurt. I knew that pain all too well. He laughed mirthlessly. No, you're not. I'm not sorry you're facing consequences, but I am sorry you're hurting. The distinction seemed to register. He nodded once and continued down the hall, the squeaky wheel of his cart marking his retreat. As winter melted into spring, something unexpected happened. I found my place within the courthouse community Catherine had nurtured. I joined the County Historical Society, hosted fundraisers for building improvements, and established a scholarship similar to the one Catherine had created for Maria's son. People who had known my grandmother began sharing more stories. Not just about her fairness on the bench, but about her mischievous sense of humor, her terrible cooking, her passionate advocacy for historic preservation. Through their memories I found pieces of her I'd never known, and by extension pieces of myself. And Daniel? Something changed in him too. The resentment gradually faded from his eyes. He began taking pride in his work. The floors shone a little brighter, the brass fixtures gleamed. Walter reported that he never complained, never arrived late. 6 months into his service, I was working late in what had once been Catherine's chambers, now my office for the foundation. A knock at the door revealed Daniel with his cleaning supplies. Sorry, he said, genuinely apologetic. I didn't realize anyone was still here. It's fine. Come in. He moved efficiently around the office, emptying the waste bin, dusting shelves. His movements had the confidence of routine now, not the awkwardness of someone performing unfamiliar tasks. The foundation's doing good work, he said, nodding toward the architectural plans on my desk. The ramp installation for the west entrance will help a lot of people. Surprised by his observation, I nodded. That was Catherine's plan originally. I'm just carrying it forward. She would have been proud of you. The words seemed to surprise him as much as me. I mean it, Rachel. You've done something meaningful here. He paused, looking around the office. I never really got her, you know? Judge Catherine. I thought she was just a stern old lady taking you away from me. I didn't see the legacy she was building. Yeah. He finished cleaning in silence, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Not just for the affair or the money. I'm sorry I didn't understand what mattered to you. After he left, I sat in Catherine's chair, my chair now, and gazed at her portrait on the wall. 6 months ago I'd wanted revenge, wanted to see Daniel suffer. But watching him find humility through honest work hadn't brought the satisfaction I'd expected. Instead, it had given me perspective. The Mason clause wasn't about punishment. It was about restoration. Daniel was rebuilding his character through daily labor. I was rebuilding my life through purpose. Even the courthouse itself was being restored, beam by beam, brick by brick. Catherine had known all along what I was just beginning to understand. True justice wasn't about making others feel small. It was about creating the space for people to become better, including yourself.